There was a boy sitting on the steps crying, and looking at him, there was only one question. If he had at least one person who could give him love, there would be another end waiting for him. But at that moment, suddenly someone's gentle and tender hand touched his face. And looking at the girl in front of him, the boy calmed down a little. And that very day changed his fate completely. One day, this boy's father, carrying the girl in his arms, looked at his son and wondered why he had come out to meet them. And she only stared at the boy in amazement, wondering if it was Lucian. Then she said that she knew the boy, for his face was familiar to her. At this moment, Lucian, confidently looking at the protagonist, informed his father that he had come here because he heard that his younger sister was coming today. At that moment, the girl only remembered where she had seen him. And then she remembered that his face, it was exactly the same face as one of the main characters of the web novel that the protagonist had read before being reborn. After which the girl stated that before she moved in, she had lived as a loner locked in the four walls of her room. And to top it all off, she had something that made her more depressed than anything else. And then holding her phone in her hands with the web novel open, she was thinking about something she literally couldn't believe, because the story she'd been following for 3 years had a terrible ending. Because in the finale, the protagonist and his lover died. And upon learning about it, the protagonist was so shocked that she immediately started writing and asking the author, does he think that such a sad ending really should have happened in this story? And then accused the author of having no conscience if he did something like this to the characters. But apparently, the protagonist fell asleep while writing an angry comment. And when she opened her eyes, the first thing she heard was the voice of a maid asking my lady to raise her head a little. And then with a smile, I showed her the different brooches and asked her which brooch she liked best. But the protagonist just looked around in shock and literally couldn't believe that she'd found a whole other world in front of her. And so in a panic, she began to wonder if this was the transmigration she'd heard about, because she liked to read similar novels, and immediately realized what was going on. But after looking around at her maids, the awkward girl wondered what kind of affair she was in, but then realized it probably wasn't that important. But the next moment, she was interrupted from her musings by a woman who ran in and called out to the protagonist. It was her mother, who came in with her father. And then coming closer to her, the man looking at his daughter, the father said that his daughter was really beautiful today, as she always was. And her mother just stroked her head happily. And in the end, the love of these caring parents for their daughter, whose body the protagonist had moved into, slowly healed her soul, which had once been empty and sullen. And in time, the girl was able to get used to this life, for she was the only daughter of Count Orlando. Her name was Rachel de Orlando. Ended up being approached by her father one day and informed his daughter that he and Rachel's mom would be gone for a while today. So he wondered if their daughter would wait for them. And then she only cheered at the announcement that she would look forward to them. And the father smilingly informed her that in that case, he would count on his daughter. Then he hugged her joyfully, and remembering this, Rachel de Orlando stated that even if the love of these beautiful people was meant to be with her, it was really enough for her, and she just wanted to live such a happy life full of caring love. But that day was the last time Rachel de Orlando saw her parents. After all, they had a carriage accident and left this world. And so while the protagonist was in fierce sadness and grief, her uncle took over all the titles in the family lineage. But one day, a man came to her home to express his deepest regret for the tragedy that had befallen the two spouses. Then he said he knew their daughter was all alone. That very day, an imperial duke came to see her and said he'd like to adopt her. And then I give her my hand and tell her that he was her godfather and a close friend of her father's. And finally, taking the girl, he told Rachel that now she could be calm because he would protect her and no one could touch her. But the madly excited uncle, looking at the leaving man, only told the duke that the girl was his niece. But Rachel didn't care at all, for she felt that she would be much safer with this man than with her greedy uncle. And then sitting in the carriage, the excited protagonist looked at Duke Leon and thought about the fact that his name was already familiar to her, but she didn't dare to ask him anything yet. Then they drove in silence, and when they arrived, the protagonist admiringly looked at the huge mansion that was in front of them and literally could not believe her eyes. And then the man lifted her in his arms and sadly looked at her and told her that everything that belonged to his family was now hers. And then embracing her, he stated that she was the daughter of a very close friend of his, and therefore to him, Rachel de Orlando was like his own daughter. And it was at that moment that their son approached them. And then the man looked at his son carefully and asked him why he had come. But he only stated that he had already heard that his younger sister had arrived. And then the protagonist thought about the fact that she had heard his name earlier. But Duke Leon said with a smile that he was delighted with Lucian's behavior. He had finally done the decent thing, and he was good for coming out and waiting here the whole time. He looked at Lucian and said that he would like them to meet and introduced Rachel, warning Lucian that they would be living together. But the girl herself only scrutinized the boy in front of her and realized that she knew him well. He had long eyelashes and golden-colored eyes, as well as scarlet lips and an indifferent face, and this little mole right under my eye. So this was the protagonist of a novel she'd read before the migration. And it was also her favorite character, and he was a repentant Mad Lucian. But at that moment, Duke Leon informed his son that pretty soon, Rachel de Orlando would carry on their family name. It was only at that moment that the protagonist realized who she had become. Rachel de Orlando, whose body she was now in, was Lucian's younger sister, and Duke Leon spoiled this girl too much as a child, and she turned into an arrogant girl. And so she bullied her older brother in every way possible. So she ended up being the first to die at the hands of her own brother. And thinking about it, mad, frightened protagonist literally did not understand what to do with such a fate, because she madly did not want to die. And then looking at Lucian so thoughtful and attentive, she thought that she certainly could not die at the hands of her favorite character. Eventually, some time came, and already in her room, Rachel de Orlando began to think about what she should do, and realized that first, she had to deal with the whole situation and structure it in some way. Then stated that the stories she had read told of Lucian's younger years, and in lamenting them, Rachel de Orlando could state that his childhood had been miserable enough. But at first glance, it was hard to imagine that a boy from such a noble family could have had an unhappy childhood. But it was very simple. He had to endure his father's abuse every day. Lucian's father and the man who brought Rachel into his home was Duke Pedro Leon. And so when Pedro himself was young, he was also bullied by his father, the previous duke. But in his case, it was because he had an intense love, but not for women, for men. And the man Pedro loved so much was the protagonist's father. And these two carefully cultivated their love under the guise of friendship. But one day all this came to an end, as the Duke found out about it, and since then, psychological and physical abuse began on him for supposedly educational purposes. And eventually, the future Duke had to part with his lover, and he married the girl his father had chosen for him. So the man was determined to put his remorse and love for the protagonist's father behind him, and he was determined to be a good husband to his wife and a great father to his future child. However, the son turned out to be very much like his father, which left the boy's psyche permanently broken. And it was for this reason that Duke Leon was never able to love Lucian. And then Rachel de Orlando thought about it and realized that male love is everywhere in this story, including their fathers. But then she realized that the most important thing was Lucian's condition and her death. So she realized she had to get herself together first, because it wasn't that bad. And living in the same house as her favorite character in history could easily make her happier. But at that moment, there was a sudden knock on which the surprised protagonist turned around, because she did not expect anyone in her room. But when she invited someone to come in, it was Lucian, who looked at her from the door with his scrutinizing yellow eyes. And then the literally dazzled protagonist immediately realized that this was the appearance of the story's protagonist. After which he looked the lad over attentively, waiting for an explanation of his coming. And then he awkwardly informed him that he would like to have a little talk with Rachel. And she only smiled awkwardly, inviting him to sit down at the table. But she seemed so happy with his arrival that even Lucian himself was embarrassed. As a result, when they were at the table and waiting for the maid to arrive, Rachel de Orlando could not take her eyes off Lucian and was literally delighted by the presence of this young man in her room. But at that moment, she was distracted by a maid who announced that she would henceforth work as Rachel de Orlando's personal maid. But afterwards, she was surprised to notice that Rachel de Orlando was not alone in the room, and there was also a young gentleman present. And the girl had evidently not expected to see something like this. But the protagonist didn't get confused and told her maid that she was on time, so she asked for a cup of tea. But she was confronted by a madly surprised girl who looked at Rachel, trying to tell her something, and seemed concerned about Lucian's presence in her room. And so the protagonist looked at her carefully and wondered why she acted so confused when she saw Lucian. But at that moment, the boy calmly announced that he'd come for a while. But notwithstanding the strain, Rachel de Orlando spoke to the maid, who looked at the girl calmly and told her that her brother had come to see her, and she didn't understand what the problem was. And then a slightly surprised, awkward maid bowed before her and asked them to wait a little while. And the protagonist was still looking around the door where this maid had gone, trying to understand her odd behavior. Some more time passed, and handing her brother a cup of tea, Rachel de Orlando, literally glowing with joy, said that he could drink it in peace, because she had not touched anything yet, and therefore he could not worry. But he reported with a calm and dispassionate expression that he wasn't allowed to eat now. But such words of the main character meant only with surprise. So looking carefully at the guy, asked what it was connected with. And at that moment, shocked the girl, he informed her that it was not yet time for the meal. And a madly surprised Rachel de Orlando thought it sounded crazy, and as if they were in the army. And it was at that moment that Rachel de Orlando realized her destiny to be in this story for her favorite character. Then she scrutinized his hands and noted that he had insanely thin wrists for his age, and he was insanely thin, and was more miserable than most people, but never cried. And so as Rachel de Orlando scrutinized him, she thought that a man like that couldn't possibly be so thin and miserable. He was the madman from the story, so she thought she should start by fattening him up, and then change the way of thinking of this character. Then mentally addressing the author of the story, stated that she absolutely refused to watch her favorite character meet a tragic end. All the more so because she was desperate to survive. But the next moment, returning from her musings, she looked awkwardly around at Lucian and wondered if he had a definite time to eat. But he calmly said that he already lives according to the established order. And then the protagonist thought about it and realized that this is really crazy. In fact, if we're talking about the routine mentioned in the original, Lucian practices alone at dawn before the sun rises, as well as eating food that was clearly inappropriate for his growing body. And then he'd go to his father's house every time he was punished. And if that was his routine, it was horrible. And so trying to hide her emotions, Rachel de Orlando reflected on the fact that Lucian had begun to feel perfectly normal about the beatings from his father, as well as the harsh discipline. Then she immediately remembered the reaction of the maid who was supposed to serve her. And then Rachel de Orlando realized that apparently all the people who worked in the house had not bothered to tell Lucian that this attitude towards him was strange. And for this reason, the protagonist realized that the situation that had happened to Lucian was insanely scary. But then she turned to her brother and said that she had heard earlier that it was better to make 2 schedules in advance for peace of mind, and added that one of them was to be the main one and the other in case the first one didn't go according to plan. And then Lucian, who had thought about her words, stated that he had never heard of such a thing before. But Rachel de Orlando took advantage of his ignorance to tell him that if Lucian made 2 daily routines, he'd be prepared for the unexpected, and his life would be much easier. And then when he thought about it, he realized he needed his father's permission to do something like that. And at that moment, Rachel de Orlando literally glared at him and asked Lucian to try to get that permission. And herself conceived that she felt madly sorry for her favorite from the novel, for she had read the original and already knew what to expect. But she did not think that Lucian's life would be so fitting a description of the doll's life. But the next moment, Rachel de Orlando looked at Lucian carefully and informed him that he was now her brother and therefore they were one family. And then wiping away her tears, said that since they were a family, she'd like to have a cup of tea with him. At that moment, seeing her upset face, the boy declared with determination that he would definitely ask his father's permission to go out with Rachel. And at that moment, she literally glowed with happiness and thanked him for such a thing, and told him that she would be looking forward to it. Then a little while later, Rachel de Orlando showed the boy to his room and thanked him for the tea party, saying it had been fun enough. And he only looked at her with a smile as he left the room. But eventually, when he was outside her door, hidden from view, his expression immediately darkened, and he was clearly thinking about something. But after a while, he strode resolutely away, and then confessed that he thought Rachel was just a little kid who didn't understand anything. But this girl was smart enough to understand her position in the house. But Rachel's situation was different from Lucian's, who could not even get the recognition of the head of the family. And must be that is why Rachel de Orlando set him an impossible task in the form of a tea party. But then the guy exhaled and thought again about what Rachel de Orlando had told him, which was that every person should always have 2 plans. Finally, when Rachel de Orlando found herself alone, a maid approached her again and curtsied and introduced herself more formally. Her name was Amber, and she was the main character's personal maid. And then Rachel happily looked her over and asked that in the future, Amber be sure to take care of her. But the girl only looked back at her mistress with a smile and informed her that in that case, she would help Rachel de Orlando with changing into her new dress and also escort her to the dining room. Eventually, after a while, all the preparations were finished. Therefore, Rachel de Orlando was following Amber, but in the meantime was only agitatedly thinking that she had to calm down, for she had a great deal of work ahead of her, because to escape her miserable end that the original had prepared for her, and also to save Lucian from the tyranny of his own father. She had to start with the Duke first and change his feelings towards his son, but afterwards she wondered if Lucian's mother would also be present. But I didn't know the answer because I still hadn't seen the woman. Lucian's mother was also a duchess and merely Duke Pedro's partner in a political marriage. So as far as the main character knew from the story, this woman was suffering with a lingering depression, and Rachel de Orlando was worried, did this woman really not know what was going on with her son and what kind of attitude he tolerated? Or maybe she just pretended not to know about it. And then thinking about it all, Rachel de Orlando stated that this family was really disgusting and they all had mental health issues. But at that moment, she was taken out of her musings by Amber, who looked at the protagonist carefully and said that they had already arrived, but then looked at her worried face and asked, did something happen? But then the girl calmly assured her that everything was all right. And then Amber opened the door and told the Duke that my lady had arrived. As a result, when the doors opened, she immediately saw Duke Leon sitting in his seat with all sorts of delicious food surrounding him. And then looking at this picture, Rachel de Orlando was shocked. She couldn't believe how much they had in store for them. But Duke, I decided with a smile looking over Rachel de Orlando, stated that she had come and seemed to be insanely happy about such a thing. And then walking further into the room, a surprised Rachel de Orlando looked at the fact that the room was completely empty except for the two of them, Amber. So she wondered if her brother and the Duchess were late, but realized she should watch her expression. She smilingly greeted the Duke and then asked if no one else was coming through, and stated that there was a lot of food on the table, and therefore she expected more people to be there. But the man only said with a smile that he would like to spend a little more time with his daughter. Rachel de Orlando looked closely at Duke Leon and wondered if he really thought of her as his own daughter. After all, he had already addressed her in a very different way, but still smiled happily and thanked the Duke. But she didn't do it as sincerely as she would have liked, because at about the same time, she was well aware that Lucian was following his basic schedule and training hard. And Rachel de Orlando was well aware that such love and care should have gone to the Duke's son and not to her, but then smilingly said she had something she wanted to ask the Duke. She thought about it, though she found it rather unsettling to ask. But she met her interest only with the attentive gaze of Duke Leon, who looked her over and waited to see what question she would ask. And then the girl cautiously wondered if the man was really going to have her daughters and still didn't seem to believe it. But he only looked her over carefully and told her that it was his duty as godfather to become her guardian. And then thinking of his words, Rachel de Orlando wondered if the Duke really did regard her as part of his family. But distracting her from her musings, the Duke asked with a smile if Rachel had any more questions, while she looked at her food on the table and realized that there was something else that interested her more than anything else. And having made up her mind, she looked a little awkwardly at the Duke, inquiring, does he not eat with her elder brother? Then she looked at the man and mentally asked him to finally invite his son to dinner. But the man only smilingly stated that his son had his own eating schedule, which would make it impossible for him to be around them now. But the insanely disgruntled Rachel de Orlando only wondered that once again everyone around her was talking about some obscure routine. And she didn't understand why it was even necessary to make life so difficult for her own child. And then I realized that's probably why the guys nicknamed him Doll when he grew up. But at that moment, taking advantage of her position, the protagonist glared at her. After all, she wanted them to sit at the same table as a family. But she only faced the attentive gaze of a man, a gaze that seemed to express absolutely nothing, yet looked somehow ominous. And so, looking into his face, Rachel de Orlando thought with embarrassment that perhaps she had been too insolent, but she hoped madly that Lucian would still be able to eat at least some of his food properly. But then to her surprise, the Duke informed her with a smile that he would fulfill anything his daughter wanted. And so looking around at the servants who were on the other side of the long table, he asked them to bring the child. And then the protagonist literally glowed and thanked the man for honoring her request. But at that moment, she encountered Duke Leon's rather serious, attentive gaze, and was a little unsure what such attention was due to. But the next moment he took her hair with a smile and began to scrutinize it, and observed that Rachel de Orlando was just as constantly thanking him. That's why she reminded him insanely of one person. And then the girl realized who it was about, because now the Duke was looking at her. But at the same time, he saw his lover. And although she understood it, but for some reason, she was insanely hurt. But the next moment, the voice of the servants was heard to announce that young Mr. Lucian had arrived. And the next moment, the young man himself appeared in the dining room before them, waiting for what his father would tell him. But he only encountered the admiring gaze of the protagonist, which made him feel insanely awkward. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, and Rachel de Orlando only reflected that her favorite was as irresistible as ever and continued to watch Lucian closely as he took a seat at the table. And when he was in his seat, the girl smiled happily as she began to eat her dinner, saying that everything was delicious, and she offered her brother a taste. And looking at him, she thought that she should have fed the boy more, so he could put on a little weight. At this moment, looking at such a cute main character, the Duke also smiled madly happy. But he smiled only at the sight of the girl, but not at his son. But while listening to their conversations, Lucian himself was watching Rachel intently, and he literally couldn't take his eyes off of her. And it seemed like a lot of thoughts were going through his head at that moment. Finally, when their dinner was over, the protagonist waved happily to the Duke and also to Lucian, saying goodbye to them and thanking them for the meal. Then she left with the maid, and the Duke waved goodbye to her, while Lucian seemed madly saddened by her departure. And then the protagonist went to her room thinking that she was insanely happy when she dined with Lucian. But her hasty mercy made the lad suffer still more. For immediately after they parted, the Duke made his son come into his cabin, and it was obvious what was going on there. And then the girl thought that the moment she asked the guy to come to dinner, she couldn't imagine that it would lead to such a horrible ending. Finally leaving his father's study and limping, Lucian thought for a second that he thought his father had finally recognized him as a son proper. But it wasn't like that at all. For in his office, the man grudgingly questioned, did his son really decide to go AWOL to Rachel's house? Then he looked at Lucian with contempt and asked him how he could do such a thing and how his son could not even report it to him. But all Lucian could do was remain silent at such a remark, for there was no answer in his head. It was just the memory of a wildly happy Rachel de Orlando thanking him for the tea party and telling him she'd had fun with him. And so the next moment he just calmly told his father that he had come to see Rachel because she was now his little sister. But the next moment, to the young man's great surprise, his father ascertained that Rachel de Orlando was begging madly to call Lucian to the table. He looked at him unhappily and wondered how he could make an innocent child do something like that and didn't even seem to want to hear an explanation. After all, when Lucian tried to inform him that he hadn't asked for anything like that, the Duke only shouted unhappily and informed him not to even think about doing anything stupid. Then he raised his stick and said that it was time to fix Lucian's stupid head. After that, what happened all the time began. I remember all of this. The guy started choking insanely hard. Still clinging to the wall, Lucian wondered why he was breathing so hard after the lesson his father had taught him and thought he should go back to his room as soon as possible. And then, trying to look completely unperturbed, he went to his room, the only place where no one was there and no one could hurt him. Amber ended up pulling out the beautiful dresses the next day, after which stated that it was a gift from the Duke that he had given her. And Rachel, just admiring these dresses, couldn't believe she'd gotten them and seemed insanely embarrassed by the gift. At that moment, Amber smiled and wondered which of these outfits Rachel de Orlando would wear today, but she couldn't decide which one to wear. But then she pointed to the blue dress and told Amber that it was the most modest and decent. She was surprised, but didn't argue. Eventually, when Amber helped the main character get dressed, the girl resolutely left her room to go meet Camille, and was determined to finally talk to her. And she knew she had to come to some kind of decision. Camille was Lucian's mother, and she wanted to see the woman who had given birth to her favorite and treated him so coldly. Eventually, when they found themselves outside the Duchess's chambers, her maid bowed and apologized for the fact that her mistress could not receive her now, for she was not very well. And then, thinking about it, Rachel de Orlando clearly realized that she was now just trying to be escorted out even without wanting to meet her. But then sadly stated that it was rather presumptuous to expect the Duchess to want to see her own stepdaughter, whom her husband had brought unauthorized, especially as it was the child of the man's lover. It was obvious from the first moment they were together that the Duchess would fall into depression. She had a husband who was forced on her by a political marriage, and a husband who never loved her. And her husband was also the man who hated her own son and cared only for the daughter of his past love. So eventually the Duchess's feelings reached such a high peak that the inevitable happened. And so the woman on her knees to the Duke said that the very first step in breaking up this marriage had already taken place, and then tearfully looked at the Duke and told him that he was the one who had made the move, and it was all his fault. It was after these words that the Duchess fainted and eventually died. So now when Rachel de Orlando stood before the Duchess's maid, she asked that the women convey her wishes for a speedy recovery. Then turning around and walking away for the last time, she wished that the Duchess could finally overcome her mental illness and finally start taking care of her only son, until the point where it's too late to take care of him. Finally, stepping back a little farther, Rachel Durlando stated that first of all, she was able to make sure that right now absolutely no one cared about Lucian but her. But at that moment, she was looked over by a maid who smilingly inquired whether Rachel Durlando was about to go to her room. But she calmly informed her that she had quite different plans. After which she asked the maid decisively where her brother Lucian was now. While in his room, Avi was doing some work and taking notes while studying a book. But at that moment, a knock sounded unexpectedly, and Lucian seemed to be madly surprised, since it was rare for anyone to visit him on principle. But when he opened the door, he found that behind that door was Rachel Durlando, who smiled happily as she held a basket of fruit in her hands and greeted her brother. But he only looked at her awkwardly and wondered why she had come. But she was only happy to say that she'd come bearing fruit and offered them something to eat together. Then she mentally noted that she was well aware of how poorly Lucian was eating, because he would eat whatever food was given to him. So she had to feed the boy a little bit so he wouldn't starve. But he only turned around to go to his desk and said that he was currently scheduled to rewrite a history book, and asked that Rachel Durlando return to her room. But she just looked at him sadly and thought that once again everyone around her was just talking about graphs. But then she looked sadly at the boy and wondered if he had thought of making 2 routines, and wondered if they had not yet been made. But he calmly said, without even turning to Rachel, that his father had wished to keep 1 routine. Whereupon Sev stated for deceit that only then could he be the perfect successor who would be capable of running the family. And then Rachel Durlando looked at him carefully and said that she didn't want to interfere with his routine. But she knew it was obvious that Lucian would give in. He was like a child. If something didn't go his way, he'd throw it away. And so she plucked 1 grape and held it to Lucian's mouth, at which he was madly surprised. And then the main character smilingly informed him that if he had to do everything according to his routine, she would just put grapes in his mouth so he could stay focused. But he only looked at Rachel in surprise and awkwardness, not understanding why she would do such a thing. But she only informed him with a smile that he would keep writing it off and just open his mouth when he saw her holding the grapes out to him. Then with a smile approaching him, asked him to do as she explained. But Lucian seemed insanely pleased with her behavior. But the girl didn't keep giving up and literally glowing tried to convince Lucian to do as she asked. And eventually at some point he gave in and ate the grapes. And the madly embarrassed and delighted protagonist looked him over and asked him if he had tasted good and if he liked those grapes, but encountered only silence in response, and so excitedly decided that apparently she had been too assertive. But after scrutinizing Lucian again, she wondered what his so blank expression on his face meant. But the next moment, to her surprise, he turned on her and bestowed his attentive gaze upon her. And then looking at his face, Rachel Durlando tried to find an answer to whether Lucian liked her or not. But afterwards, she smiled and told Lucian to ignore her and to keep studying. But he only grudgingly noticed that because he had been distracted by his sister, he had left a big blot on the paper. So he grudgingly picked up the sheet and realized that he should have rewritten the whole thing. But Rachel Durlando only asked if he would like to taste the raspberries, and then holding them out to Lucian, said that she would put them in his mouth too. But he again only looked awkwardly at her and at the raspberries she was holding out to him, and did not realize whether he really ought to have done something like this. But the next moment they were distracted by Amber, who, apologizing for this interference, said that she had come to escort the girl, as the Duke had called her. And when Rachel Durlando heard about it, she was insanely excited. She looked at Lucian and put the basket on the table and told him she had to go. She asked Lucian to eat in his spare time, then smiled and waved him goodbye and wished him further strength in rewriting his books. But when the door closed, Lucian looked at the fruit basket in all seriousness and decided to give it a try, and took a raspberry and tasted it. But afterwards I thought with some sadness that everything was basically as expected, because Marina was completely tasteless. But remembering Rachel stated that the grapes the girl had given him had a definite sort of flavor, sour sweet, and it was quite surprising. But at that moment he was approached by some evil essence, which with a smile informed him that it was really quite strange. After all, the guy couldn't taste when he was under the influence of this shadow. And the shadow wondered, was it all due to the special powers that came from this child? But maddeningly displeased Lucian only demanded that the shadow stop talking to him. Finally, walking down the hallways, Rachel Durlando reflected that it had been a month since she had moved into this place, and the Leon family had officially adopted her. So she became Rachel de Leon. And finally, the protagonist made another attempt to see the Duchess. but was again confronted by a maid who informed her that it would be difficult for her mistress to see her again. And then Rachel Durlando with a sad smile on her face. She wondered if the Duchess had still not welcomed her. However, she realized that if she didn't greet the wife of the master of the family, it would offend the woman even more. So she only closed her eyes and asked the maid to convey her wishes for the Duchess's speedy recovery. She thought mentally that she wanted the Duchess to recover and to take care of her son, after which the girl stated that the situation with the Duke was still the same. After all, the man was still insanely affectionate, friendly with the girl. But as soon as they talked about his son, he had a look of discontent on his face that was hard to hide, even though he tried. So Rachel Durlando mentally asked the man to take care of her son the same way. But in the end now, Rachel Durlando watched in amazement at a picture that maddeningly surprised her. And then the protagonist stated that this guy hadn't changed a bit either. And he was still as handsome as ever. But he was still following his brutal daily routine. And so Rachel Durlando had to look for some inaccuracies in that routine where she could squeeze in. That was why she was here, and noticing her, Lucian turned around in surprise. And taking advantage of the fact that he was a little distracted to him, ran up to the main character and with a happy smile said hello to his brother and said that he should have eaten a little and then continue training. But he only waved his hands. Rachel was madly surprised, so she looked at him carefully, expecting some explanation. But a frantically excited Lucian looked over at Rachel only to wonder what he should have said, then turned around and told the girl that it was dangerous enough to be with him and asked her to stay away from him while he was practicing. But at that moment, suddenly she called out to him and asked him to take a moment of his time. Then she pointed to a bench that was a little further away and smilingly stated that training takes a lot of energy. So she suggested that he sit down a little so he could rest. And as he set down his sword, the girl admitted that she had brought refreshing iced tea. And Lucian didn't resist to much anymore, and so sat on the bench just waiting. And while rummaging through the things Rachel Durlando had brought with her, she drew out several glasses as well as tea. But when she turned around, she saw a handsome and tired young man, and so stated that her favorite was as beautiful as ever today. After which she handed him a cup of tea with a smile and offered him a drink and some rest. And he gave me an awkward look, but he accepted the glass. And after scrutinizing the tea, he addressed his sister by name. But to her great surprise, he told her that Rachel's frequent visits were putting him in an insanely difficult position. Then looked sadly at the girl and confessed that he really should have moved according to the daily routine. And then Rachel Durlando thought sadly that it was expected enough, for she had been constantly seeking to meet her boyfriend for the whole month. And if she spotted Lucian on her way to a place, she was always making conversation, so it wasn't strange that he'd gotten madly sick of her in the meantime. But to her great surprise, Lucian informed her that it was all to do with Rachel not being on his schedule. And then she awkwardly apologized that Lucian was definitely right and promised that she would be much more careful from now on. But he only looked back at the girl to tell her that he didn't mean that at all. And he wanted to say that the problem was the schedule that had been made up for him, and then added that the problem wasn't Rachel at all, and he was dying to see her too. And then scrutinizing him a little embarrassed, the protagonist literally couldn't believe what he said. And she couldn't understand if he had just been really worried that his words might hurt her. And so she literally couldn't believe that Lucian, who was known for his coolness, could express his feelings like that. But then she scrutinized his face and informed him that if there was a problem, it wasn't that he disliked her, just the scheduling. She suggested that he incorporate it into his routine, but he only looked at the protagonist in surprise and wondered what she meant when she asked to be included in a routine. But the girl only watched admiringly at such a cute expression on her brother's face, literally, and glowed. After which she also watched him intently as he drank his tea and reflected with admiration that even as he ate, drank, and did whatever he did, he looked insanely cute. But then pondering her offer, Lucian informed her that if he included Rachel in the schedule, she would have to accompany him all day, and wondered if she wanted it that badly. But to his great surprise, he was confronted with the girl's insanely joyful reaction, who literally glowed and wanted to scream that this was exactly what it was about, but ordered herself to calm down. She looked at Lucian carefully and told him that she wanted him to find a time in his schedule when she could come to see him, and added with a smile that then he could easily give her some time without sacrificing other things. But he only thought sadly that he had to get his father's permission to do something like that. And when Rachel Durlando heard about it, she thought sadly that since they'd only known each other for a month, he might not agree to something like that. It was obvious what it meant to him, but at that moment, to his surprise, the protagonist calmly stated that there was nothing wrong with it, and added with a smile that she certainly didn't want to bring him any hardship. And then, looking into her face, Lucian promised with a smile that he would ask his father. And then when Rachel d'Orlando heard about it, she cheerfully rose and whirled around thinking that Lucian had finally been able to open up to her at least a little, and had changed so much this month from the way she knew him. But at that moment, to his great shock, his father's voice came out and turned to Rachel. Then he looked at the girl with a smile and asked what his daughter was doing and what she was doing here. And at this moment, seeing his father, Lucian rose at once fearfully from his seat and looked him over carefully, not knowing what to say. But afterward, he just watched silently as the Duke stroked Rachel's head, and the man informed the girl that her dress had already been made. So he suggested she finally go try it on, and she only happily agreed. And then Luciano looked at his father's face and thought that he would also like the Duke to look at him with those eyes, and thought that if he could complete all the programs and become the perfect heir, maybe his father could look at him the same way he looked at his sister. But he was distracted from thinking by the protagonist, who smiled happily and waved at him, saying that it was time for her to go, and wished him good luck. But he only looked at her in silence. Then he watched her leave for a while longer. Duke Leon only glared angrily at his son, and then he called him by name and demanded that he go into his office. In the end, after a while, the Duke looked at his son unhappily and wondered whether he had not succeeded in influencing his son's stupid brain with his lessons. But he calmly said it wasn't like that at all. And then the Duke shrieked and asked why Rachel d'Orlando sought him out so often. But he calmly said he didn't know that either. But at that moment, the Duke literally shook and, looking at his son's eyes, stated that his father had exactly the same look. The sight of the one who cursed him, as well as his lover, as well as separated and ultimately destroyed their love. And so Duke Leon simply could not allow Lucian, who so resembles his father, to remain near his lover's child. Then the man looked at Lucian unhappily and wondered if he was thinking of using such an innocent child, and said that his son was really disgusting. But he just tried to make up some excuse, but realized no one would listen to him. So I sadly reported that I'd never even considered something like that. But the Duke only grudgingly declared that now Lucian would have no contact with Rachel, and even if she comes to him, and told his son not to even think he could stay near that girl. And then he was outside his father's office, thinking that what his father had said was true, and he was insanely jealous of Rachel, but he'd never even considered using her. Then, leaning against the wall, he thought about what he should do to make his father finally notice him. But he was approached by an ominous shadow who informed him that it was all useless, and no matter how hard he tried, nothing would change. And no matter what this guy does, the Duke's attitude will never change and the man will never recognize him. And then, sadly, Lucian reflected that though he wanted to object, he also understood it well. For in his father's eyes, he was like a ghost to beat without a shadow. And then this sinister shadow asked Lucian to just give up and never torture himself again, and demanded that Lucian finally give up his body. And then he let the guy sleep a peaceful sleep. And the guy closed his eyes and thought that it was just like that, and he was much better off just giving his body to that spirit. And he was already determined to do it. But at that moment, a joyful Rachel d'Orlando appeared in front of him and greeted her brother with a smile. And at that moment, the shadow immediately backed away, and madly surprised Lucian only looked around at her, wondering what she was doing here. But she only smiled and wondered if Lucian had any business left in this place, and promised not to disturb him. Then, grabbing his hand with a smile, she told him that she wanted to walk with Lucian to his room. And it was only at that moment, when Rachel d'Orlando grabbed his arm, that Lucian thought about the fact that there was only one person in this whole place who noticed him. And such thoughts make him feel warmer, which make him intercept the girl's palm more confidently. And then they walked together. And initially, Rachel d'Orlando was very surprised at something like this, because Lucian had never done this before. But then she just smiled and thought that maybe he was starting to open up to her. Then she ran down the hallway and smiled at him, asking him to hurry to his room, while she thought about the fact that Lucian had taken her hand for the first time, which she was so happy about. As a result, after walking a little bit through the corridors, they were silent. But after interrupting the silence, the girl asked what Lucian would do next according to his schedule, and suggested that he should go to rewrite the history books. But when he confirmed her hunch, it was with sadness that Rachel d'Orlando thought about the fact that they would reach the guy's room quite soon. But she was madly reluctant to let go of his hand. So she stopped and said she didn't know why, but her legs were hurting like crazy. And seeing Lucian's surprise, she literally glowed and asked if they could stop and rest for a while. But seeing his so serious look, Rachel d'Orlando was already starting to get excited, thinking that maybe now Lucian would just leave her here and go off on his own. But to her surprise, he only gently bent down on his knee in front of her to be on the same level and offered her a solution to such a situation. And then I was shocked to think that I could never have believed the situation would happen, when her favorite characters from the story would carry her on their own backs to make it easier for her to walk, and embarrassed to think that she was probably the happiest person in the world. But the next moment she was interrupted by Lucian, who calmly informed the girl that they had already reached his room. Afterwards, and once on the ground, the protagonist smiled happily and thanked her brother for carrying her. And he only looked calmly at Rachel and stated that she could go to rest now, and then approached her door. But at the last moment, he was accosted by the protagonist and waved good luck. She smiled at Lucian. She thought she was sad because she wanted to spend more time with him. But finding himself on the other side of the door, Lucian only looked at his hand that had just held Rachel de Orlando, after which he resolutely clenched his fist and seemed to have made some sort of decision for himself at that moment. And turning around, he resolutely went about his business, with one last glance at the door behind which Rachel de Orlando was now hiding. In the end, after a while, the protagonist did not despair and again came to the Duchess. But this time, the maid reported that the mistress was waiting for Rachel inside and allowed her to come in. And then the madly delighted girl literally could not believe that she had at last obtained permission from the Duchess and would be able to greet her. Then the maid stepped away from the door to open it and asked Rachel de Orlando to come in. And the girl only reflected that yesterday Lucian had taken her hand for the first time. And today, even the Duchess had decided to see her. And the next moment, the Duchess's personal maid informed her mistress that Lady Rachel de Orlando had arrived. And at that moment, the protagonist sadly realized that she was not addressed as my lady, but simply as lady, which directly meant that the Duchess did not accept her in this family. But after Rachel de Orlando thought about it, it didn't matter to her anyway. After all, it was so that the Duchess could take care of her son. That was the only purpose of her arrival. And finally, when the door opened, she saw a woman sitting by the window looking out at the scenery there. And then breaking the silence, the protagonist curtsied and then greeted the Duchess by saying that Rachel de Orlando had come to see her. But at that moment, to the girl's great surprise, a question came from the Duchess, who inquired if Rachel de Orlando knew the word mirage. Then, seeing her incomprehension, I calmly explained that they say that in the country that neighbored the empire, there is a desert covered with dry sands. And she had heard the story of a traveler who had fallen behind the caravan and wandered alone in the desert for days. And he ended up walking along the road for a long time, and one day a traveler weary of his thirst came across an oasis of clear water right in the middle of the desert. And so he immediately rushed to this oasis and scooped up more water. However, only sand came into his mouth. It was an illusion, or it was an illusion. In other words, it's called a mirage. Then she looked at Rachel and asked her what she thought of the story. And it are mirages only in deserts. And then said she hoped Rachel de Orlando would never dive headfirst into the sand because she mistook it for an oasis. And then looking closely at Duchess Rachel de Orlando realized that it had just been a warning. For what she was now enjoying was only a mirage, and she had been warned not to let her guard down and not to be deceived by an illusion that would one day disappear. And then she bowed her head and smiled and said yes. She thought about the fact that she didn't plan to stay in this house forever anyway. And she wanted her beloved Lucian to finally find happiness and live the life of an ordinary man so that she would have no more regrets and would be free to leave. So, with a smile, she informed the Duchess not to let the woman worry, while she thought about how she would disappear the day Lucian could finally be happy. At that time, the young man himself was practicing his techniques, after which he stopped for a while and decided to rest, and his gaze went to the place where Rachel de Orlando usually came and greeted him. But there was no one there now. And then the guy realized that usually his sister always showed up around this time, but today she was late. And at that moment, a shadow spoke to him and wondered, was Lucian really so sure that this girl would always seek to meet him? For he saw for himself that the Duke treated that child differently from him. And so Rachel de Orlando can take his place as heir. About this time, Rachel de Orlando finally left the Duchess's room and reflected that it was expected that this woman was not happy about her appearance. but nevertheless they would still have to live in the same house for a while. But at that moment, she was approached by a butler who asked the protagonist if her meeting with the Duchess had gone well, then said with a smile that he had come to warn you that Rachel d'Orlando had been summoned by the Duke. But she only stared at the butler and her maid, Amber, who was behind him, wondering why the Duke wanted to meet her. But in the end, as soon as the Duke was told that Rachel d'Orlando had finally come to him, he literally glowed with joy, then demanded that the girl finally be brought to him. And when she got to his office, the man said with a smile that he'd called Rachel to go for a walk with him, and she wondered what he meant. And then the Duke said he'd like to take her for a walk and buy whatever Rachel d'Orlando wanted and eat delicious desserts from the candy store. And she literally glowed as soon as she agreed. And at that moment, the Duke said that in that case he had given orders to prepare a carriage, so they would set off at once. But the next moment, to his surprise, Rachel d'Orlando inquired whether the elder brother would not go with them. But the Mad Duke, looking at Rachel, inquired unhappily whether she did not wish to go on a walk alone with her father. But she just thought it was probably not the right time to demand something like that. Therefore, with a smile stated the Duke that she does not mind to walk with him alone, but he only said that he would be happy much more if the girl called him father. And then she looked him over carefully and wondered whether she could really call this man father, for the notion was still quite exciting to her. But at this point, looking her over with a smile, the man informed her that he understood if Rachel d'Orlando was still a little uncomfortable, and he didn't want to rush her in that regard. And then he stroked her on the head. And Rachel d'Orlando was thinking that it would be really hard for them to be a real family, and later they would all change their feelings about her. But so far she did not show it, so the man joyfully escorted her to the carriage and asked if she was glad that they were going to have fun, and she cheerfully said that she was looking forward to it. At about this time, Lucian was already going to his room, and sadly speculated that Rachel d'Orlando would be able to take the place of the successor, and thinking about how much he'd been through to get there, because every time he was beaten, it was so hard to breathe. And the servants who were there just looked at him excitedly and just realized that they'd better do nothing and ignore the guy like everyone else did. And so they calmly passed by and went on talking about their own things. And then, unable to bear feeling so awful, Lucian simply fell to the floor and tried to catch his breath. But to his surprise, the voice of the protagonist, who was calling for her brother, sounded through the corridors with a loud shout, and then immediately ran up and excitedly began to examine him and asked what he was hurting. Whereupon the madwoman frightenedly asked what had happened to him at all, and why he was so ill. And then, scrutinizing the girl in front of him, Lucian stated that this child was very different from the other people around him, so she would never betray him. But at that moment, the Shadow's voice came again, asking if everything was exactly as he thought it was, because in the end, Lucian would lose everything he had and become even more pathetic than he was now. But to this Shadow's remark, Lucian simply remained silent, continuing to ponder something of his own. At this time, Rachel d'Orlando was out shopping with Duke, and that's when she observed an insanely beautiful statue, which consisted of very beautiful figures of swan ballerinas, and a beautiful girl and boy dancing. At that moment, the Duke approached her, and after looking at her admiring face, asked his daughter if she liked something. But the next moment, he calmly told the seller that he wanted to take all the goods that were on this side, and the excited Rachel d'Orlando, looking at the Duke, literally could not believe that he really bought her all this. Then she looked around the carriage, where all the goods were still being loaded, and thought that she had bought enough for today. After which she realized that's why the real Rachel grew up in such luxury. After which she became a very bitchy person. So she immediately told the Duke in a panic that what she had already been bought was quite enough, and there was definitely no need to buy anything else. But the man only looked over at his daughter, with a smile informing her that if she really didn't want anything else, they could go out and eat something delicious. And at this moment, carefully looked in Duke Leon, the main heroine conceived what perfectly understands that this man will never become her real father, and she perfectly understood how much Lucian needed him.
but still she was madly pleased to receive such love. At this point, Lucian was sitting down to do his rewrites. But at that moment, there was a voice of a shadow, which stated that after all this child didn't come today, and convinced Lucian that tomorrow it would be the same. But the madly excited boy was even confused at such words, and left a huge stain on the sheet of paper, and listened sadly to the voice of this shadow, which states that this girl must also know that nothing good can be expected from intimacy with Lucian. Then, gazing into his insanely upset, disappointed face, the shadow seemed to enjoy his terrible well-being, and stated that first there were the guy's parents, then the servants were disappointed in him, and now even his adopted little sister was ignoring his existence. Then the shadow asked Lucian to lend his body for a while, and he promised that he would change everything and make you all recognize the guy, and no one would be able to look down on him anymore. But the next moment, to his great surprise, a knock sounded in the room, and then Lucian only shocked glanced toward the door waiting for whoever came. And as it turned out, it was Rachel d'Orlando, who smiled happily at him and then greeted him.
And coming into the room, she said she knew Lucian was doing his rewriting and said she'd gone for a walk today. And looking into his sad face, informed him that she was madly sorry that she'd been able to go along. But literally glowing, she held out the basket to Lucian and told him that even though they couldn't go out together, she had bought a lot of goodies, and so she asked Lucian to forgive her. Then she happily informed him that she was thrilled to come to Lucian's house to spend some time with him, and was glad that she was doing it for a reason. After which she added that she was also glad she could find Lucian in this place, for he was always here at this time. And at that moment, Lucian looked at Rachel for the first time with a smile and said that she was right, and he'd always been here. And then he wondered if he had always been here. But Rachel d'Orlando was the only one who noticed it. Then scrutinizing him again, her smiling face stated that she was the only one, and therefore was insanely special to him. And at that moment, the protagonist was thinking that Lucian must have been really waiting for her. So she told Lucian that she had picked out all the goodies and suggested that he try the marmalade first. And then she held it out for the boy to open his mouth. But to her great surprise, he didn't argue and just calmly did as his little sister asked. And she only looked around wondering why Lucian was so obedient today. But the next moment she started to open a jar of marmalade to get another one and give her brother a treat. But to her great surprise, he asked and waited a little longer. Then he headed a little further across the room, and after a couple minutes, Rachel d'Orlando watched as Lucian made a place for the two of them to sit. And then she sat down across from him, looking up at her brother, waiting to see what he wanted to talk to her about. But at that moment, he looked at the girl in all seriousness and wondered if she had been with his father all the time today. But she calmly set the marmalade aside to get another dessert and informed him that he was right. And today she and the Duke had gone for a walk and wondered if Luciana missed her, but saw only a slightly embarrassed guy who, despite his embarrassment, never said anything to the protagonist. And then she simply stated with a smile that whether Lucian missed her or not, she missed him madly. And then the words made Lucian blush with embarrassment. And I literally didn't know what to say to something like that. But his smile did not go unnoticed, and then the madly admiring protagonist literally could not believe what she saw. And then awkwardly stated that in his case, the wide smile on his face looked even cuter. But she only saw Lucian's madly surprised face, who didn't know what he was talking about. And then a mad frightened Rachel d'Orlando thought about the fact that she hadn't meant to say it out loud at all, and realized that she had made a huge mistake. And because of that shock, she just dropped the basket of other desserts she had been holding. So they all fell down and Rachel reached out to pick them up. But the next moment, Lucian touched her arm and asked her to stay in her seat, which the girl was madly surprised to hear. But after the guy looked at her awkwardly, he immediately withdrew his hand because he was afraid that he might hurt her by such a sudden movement. But Rachel d'Orlando's madly admiring look over him made her realize that Lucian had been insanely thoughtful today. So she was embarrassed to tell him that everything really was fine. Then watched Lucian pick up the desserts and stated that her favorite character wasn't like that at all and was insanely nice and sweet. Then offered to help him. But when they opened the dessert boxes, they were all irretrievably damaged. And looking at them with tears in her eyes, Rachel d'Orlando said that they had been insanely beautiful before, and she wanted very much to treat Lucian to these desserts. But to her surprise, the boy just calmly put his hand on Rachel's arm and reassured her that nothing was wrong. He leaned closer to her and smiled, thanking Rachel for taking such good care of him. Then he told her that he would be sure to get her father's permission. But seeing Rachel's surprise, who didn't seem to know what she was talking about, he smiled even brighter and said that he wanted his father's permission to include seeing Rachel in his daily routine. And then when Rachel de Orlando heard about it, she immediately remembered the moment she'd first suggested it. But she couldn't believe Lucian would remember her words, so she was insanely flattered, and then with a smile looking at his face, joyfully informed him that she would definitely wait for this moment. I wondered where he was supposed to be the tyrant he was in the novel. Lucian was a really sweet and caring guy, but in the next moment, the protagonist forked a strawberry and called her brother, and said that despite their appearance, these desserts must still be insanely delicious, and then held them out closer to Lucian and asked him to try them. And at that moment, she thought that she would certainly like to make Lucian happy, for this unhappy child was bound to get the good end he deserved. As a result, already in the evening being in her room, and Rachel de Orlando joyfully remembered the smiling face of her loved his character who was right in front of her, and thought that she could not wish for anything more. But in the next moment, immediately in a panic, I rose from my seat and realized that she was bound to see Lucian and his lover live a happy life together, and they won't have such a terrible ending. Then I remembered that in the original, these two died, although they loved each other very much, but they couldn't escape the misunderstandings they had accumulated due to lack of communication. And several secondary characters who were in love with Noah only exaggerated these misunderstandings between Lucian and his lover. Then the protagonist thought about the fact that now she was 10 years old, and in that case, Lucian was 15. So there was still some time left, for as far as she knew, the original story had already begun. After she realized that the main culprit for the tragic end of the novel, and the most important second character to come along, and that was Oscar. And then the protagonist clearly saw in her head as having fought with all his rivals and leaving them behind in the room to his lover entered Lucian and did not even pay attention to how many people at this moment took their lives. And then approaching his bed and stroking the young man's hair, Lucian asked the sleeping boy how he would be able to live after Noah passed away. But then he took and with his own hands drew his sword over him, and in one swift movement took his life. And at that moment, the protagonist woke up in a panic. Then I tried to catch my breath and stated that it was just a dream. But remembering everything that happened in the novel, Rachel de Orlando stated that after the death of her lover, Lucian cut his life short with his own hands. And that was the end of the story. And so Rachel de Orlando decided that she couldn't let this guy die, because whatever it took, she had to change the ending. Because in the end, Lucian and his lover should have found happiness. And at that moment, the main character will be able to leave Liam's family in peace and never bother them again, and was sure that they will be fine. And that's how the end was originally supposed to be. But at that moment, Lucian was cleaning his room. Then he looked frantically at the jar of sweets that Rachel de Orlando had brought him. And some thoughts seemed to start to enter his head. But he still went to practice, where Rachel, out of habit, happily ran over and grabbed her suitcase and called her brother. But now he didn't greet her as surprised as before, but looked at his sister with a smile. And at that moment, the protagonist was shocked to think that she could feel that edge again. And then she realized that it was the edge of perfection, because anyone would say that Lucian was the model of a caring boyfriend, and he was the best. But in the end, Rachel de Orlando calmly approached her brother and told him that she had brought some iced tea and cookies today and suggested they sit down in the shade for some food. But the excited boy tried to explain that he had a workout and a schedule. But Rachel knew exactly what he was about to say. So she told him it would only take 10 minutes, or even 5, because either way, he had to take a break during the workout. Then, looking at the excited face of the boy, said that if the Duke comes, she will be sure to say that it was she who persuaded him. But he only excitedly recalled his last conversation with his father, when he had yelled at Lucian and wondered if he was serious about including Rachel in his routine, and wondered why his son was so obnoxious. And at that moment, unable to bear such memories, the boy dropped his sword from his hands, and noticing his expression, a frantic Rachel de Orlando asked if he was all right. She noted that his complexion was insanely unhealthy and said that it would be better for them to rest for a while anyway. Then, looking at his face more seriously, she took his hand and demanded that they go into the shade, and then strode resolutely in that direction and informed Lucian that this was all because his schedule was too busy, and he was taking absolutely no care of himself. And then the embarrassed lad, looking over his sister, thought that now her determination could not be a lie. And at first he thought, too, that Rachel de Orlando was pursuing some purpose of her own. But for some reason, he liked Rachel de Orlando a lot. So he thought he'd like to see her more often and for longer if he could. But eventually finding herself under the tree, Rachel Durlando looked at her brother carefully and asked him first for some iced tea. Then she asked how he was feeling and if he didn't need to lie down for a while to rest. But he calmly said he was just a little dizzy. And as soon as Rachel Durlando heard about it, she immediately approached the young man and touched his forehead to check for a fever, and then stated that it was expected because he had a slight fever. But at that moment, to her surprise, the insanely awkward guy just turned away from her, hiding his embarrassed face, and noted that his face was hot because it was so hot outside. Then Rachel Durlando listened to him and told him that she would be a little calmer in that case, and asked her brother not to overwork himself. Then she handed him a cookie and asked him to eat a little because he would feel better. But he only asked that Rachel Durlando should also eat with him. But at that moment, suddenly, an excited Amber appeared out of nowhere, who looked around her mistress and said that the Duke was looking for her. But she only wondered what the Duke wanted from her this time. But then rose from her seat and looked at Lucian and asked him to eat and drink tea, and then leave whatever was left in the place, and she would be sure to come back and clean it up. Then she waved him off and wished him good luck in his training. But the guy himself was madly sad about the fact that Duke could see Rachel whenever he wanted. But he could hardly find at least some time for their meeting, because of what he was insanely sad. In the end, a couple minutes later, the girl found herself in the office of the Duke, who happily greeted his daughter and said that today finally delivered his order. Then pointed to 2 cages and asked if his daughter wanted to see what her father had bought. Then pulled off the cloth and reported that he had been told that these were the rare ones who belonged to the race of beastmen. And then, looking at the madly frightened, shaking beast Rachel Durlando, immediately remembered what the original Lucian had thought of the creature when he first saw it. For it was said of him that this beast was like a snow-white cloud that fell from heaven, and this same fox was Oscar. And then the protagonist stated that the beastmen were a mixture of beasts of men and their basic form was that of beasts. But when they reached puberty, they could transform into humans and had the same mental capacity as humans. However, in the Empire, beastmen were treated worse than ever, as people kidnapped them and sold them as pets or slaves. And the real Rachel Durlando received a gift from Duke Oscar, bought in just this way. And she was no different from the other people who abused these animals in every way. And it was obvious that after that, Oscar fell in love with Noah, who was different from Rachel, and from other people, and treated Oscar with love. And eventually, a little while later, Oscar escaped, taking with him a young man who had been captured by Lucian. And Lucian himself, when she learned about it, thought that perhaps his lovers got close to Oscar only to deceive him and then run away. Then he recaptured his lover, imprisoned him in a room where not even a ray of light could penetrate. And then the guy turned into a real personal puppet for Lucian, and he couldn't stand it. And so he ended up just taking his own life. But at this point, the protagonist returned from her musings to scrutinize the fox, who was shaking in the cage, and noted that Oscar had actually made the sad ending of the story a little worse. And that's why she hadn't liked him before. But she stated that Oscar was insanely cute in person. And then the Duke approached the girl and asked her if she liked the animal, and she said that he was very nice, which Duke Leon was very happy about. After which the protagonist is determined to take care of Oscar, unlike her original heroine. And so a new life with Oscar will soon await her. After which the girl announced that she'd come up with a new name for the fox cub, and said that she would call him Lumpy. Then, seeing such a shrunken face, the fox thought that she just had to change the plot to this end. She gave this little fox a new name, and then smilingly looked him over and offered to be his friend. But the next moment, the Duke happily removed a claw from the other cage and told me that there was a second animal there, and it's a falcon that could be used for hunting. And then, looking at his insanely admiring main heroine, stated that he was insanely stately, and came up with a name for the baby, saying that his name would be Damien. But she saw the fox's mad, disgruntled face, so she leaned over him and wondered if he had a problem with his name. Then she thought that maybe he thought his name was silly, but she noted that it sounded very nice.